Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. When I started this channel, I knew I would talk about topics that, whether it be the MMA media or other MMA YouTubers, would be a little bit scared to touch. And that's what this video is going to be today. Should the UFC abolish women's MMA from their organization? Obviously, the UFC can't abolish women's MMA in its entirety. They have Invicta, they have women's, MMA and other organizations, Bellator, ONE FC, etc. But over the last 2 years in particular, I believe the UFC has made quite a few mistakes, which we'll talk about later in the video, regarding women's MMA. And I also believe that women's MMA has been at a bit of stagnation over the last 2 to 3 years. And in this video, I'm going to go through each division within the UFC, each women's division within the UFC, and I'm going to give my thoughts on each weight class. And I'm going to be honest, a little bit of a spoiler here. We are closing down some divisions, okay? Because right now, I believe we are, one catastrophic event, which I believe is coming very soon, away from eliminating half of the women's MMA divisions within the UFC. So first off, before we get into any of that, the UFC and Dana White always said, we're not bringing women's MMA to the UFC. And then Ronda Rousey became very popular within Strikeforce. They decided to bring her over. And basically, Ronda Rousey, people don't realize this. There's a lot of people who just started watching MMA, started watching the UFC in the past few years. Ronda Rousey became a massive star within the UFC. And when I say a massive star, she was headlining pay-per-views, selling over 1 million pay-per-view buys multiple times. I don't remember the exact numbers right off the top of my head, but she has multiple pay-per-views where she was the headliner and they sold over 1 million buys. If you follow the UFC, if you know about star power within the UFC, you know that is a lot of pay-per-view buys, and very few fighters are able to do that. And it looked like, at this point in time, it was the early stages of women's MMA. It looked like women's MMA is going to evolve into something much, more talent-rich over the next few years, in the next 10 years. Women's MMA was still fairly early on within the development of women's MMA. And Ronda Rousey was there, dominating for a couple years. She made her UFC debut back in 2013 at UFC 157 against Liz Carmouche. Then she went on to smash Miesha Tate, smash Sarah McMahon, smash Alexis Davis, which that fight, who even wanted to see that? Destroy Kat Zingano, destroy Betch Kohea. And then in 2015, November of 2015, women's MMA took a massive hit. Holly Holm went out there and head kick KO'd Ronda Rousey. And it was shocking to the MMA community. A lot of people thought, Rousey's going to go on and just dominate these girls for the next 4 or 5 years. And had Rousey continued to win, she would still be a massive star in the UFC, and she would still be fighting to this day if she had not lost to Holly Holm. Well, after she lost to Holly Holm, she sat out for quite a while. And in the meantime, Holly Holm then lost her belt to Miesha Tate. And then in the meantime after that, Miesha Tate then lost her belt to Amanda Nunes. And then Ronda Rousey returns to fight Amanda Nunes back in December of 2016. And I remember going into this fight because Ronda Rousey was so popular that I had casual MMA fans, friends of mine who don't watch MMA nowhere near the amount I do, asking me, is Ronda going to win this fight? Is she going to go out to destroy this girl? And I was laughing my ass off. I said, Amanda Nunes is going to brutally starch her. Because Amanda Nunes, I had kept my eye on her for a while. And I thought she was going to be the fighter coming up that was going to dethrone Ronda. And obviously it ended up being Holly Holm, but I thought Nunes was going to be that fighter. And what happens back at UFC 207, December 2016, Amanda Nunes absolutely starches Ronda Rousey in the first round. And Ronda Rousey is never to be seen again. She's basically, she's in witness protection like Colby Covington at this point. We don't know. We haven't seen or heard from her. I know she's off doing WWE. But as far as the MMA community, I don't even think she's done a regular MMA media interview since before the Holly Holm fights. That's how quickly Ronda Rousey just disappeared from the sport of MMA. And she left a massive void within women's MMA because she was a huge superstar. And it's a void that I don't think has been filled since then. And we're going to start looking at some of these divisions because I really believe it's partially the UFC's fault for some mistakes that they have made. I'm going to talk about them later in the video and what they can do to improve. But also, it's just the fact that a women's MMA star like Ronda Rousey can only last so long, and there's only going to be so many of them. Ronda Rousey, at her point in time, she was an elite women's MMA fighter. But even compared to the skill level there is today, her skills weren't particularly good. At the time, she was elite. But even the amount of evolution we've had since her departure, I don't really think she's hanging too much with some of today's fighters. And that's not even a praise for those fighters. She had a moment in time where she was just ahead of the competition up until she lost to Holly Holm and Amanda Nunes. So starting off with the women's strawweight division, you have Weili Zhang as the champion, elite level fighter. And if you watched my channel for any length of time, you watched any streams, the women's strawweight division, I believe, is the most talent-rich women's division in the UFC. And it's actually one of my favorite divisions to watch. Weili Zhang versus Rose Namajunas, I believe it went down early 2021, I think April 2021. That was actually going into that year. I remember my most anticipated fight going into 2021 was Weili Zhang versus Rose Namajunas. And the strawweight division is pretty solid. It's not stacked in the capacity the UFC lightweight division or the UFC bantamweight division is. But you have the champion Weili Zhang. You have number 1, Carla Esparza. She's kind of one-dimensional, but she's still a good fighter. Number 2, Rose Namajunas. She's excellent when she shows up. And, Pat Barry's kind of dragging her down at this point. Number 3, Amanda Nunes. Very good fighter, powerful, well-rounded. Marina Rodriguez, another really good fighter within the division. I would consider her an elite level skill set. And you just go down the list. Yan Xiaonan, Jessica Andrade, Mackenzie Dern even. I know she's a jiu-jitsu submission specialist, but still solid. Tisha Torres, Amanda Hebas. When you start falling off around that 10 mark with Verna Jandiroba. But the women's strawweight division, I think, is an amazing division. And even with, let's say just the top 5 alone, you can kind of get by in the UFC just with that top 5 kind of circulating around each other. Weili Zhang, Rose Namajunas, Amanda Nunes, Jessica Andrade. I know she kind of jumps back and forth between the flyweight division and the strawweight division. But the women's strawweight division has evolved, and it has been the best women's division for the past couple years. Looking at women's flyweight, you have Valentina Shevchenko as the champion. You have Manon Fiorot as number 1 contender. This division is a step down, I believe, from strawweight. The flyweight division, I believe, is starting to evolve a little bit, but it's still not great. You have Fiorot as number 1. You have Talia Santos, who I believe is a very good fighter. Jessica Andrade, obviously, she jumps back and forth. You have number 4, Caitlin Chukagian. Number 5, Alexa Grasso, who's fighting for the belt at UFC 285. And then you start to get to number 6, Lauren Murphy. I know she was number 4 up until recently, which is just an embarrassment in general. Got destroyed by Jessica Andrade. But then you also have some contenders kind of waiting in the wings, like Erin Blanchfield at number 10. You also have, Tatiana Suarez. If she can stay healthy, she's going to be an interesting, part of the women's flyweight division. You got Casey O'Neill, Macy Barber, kind of lower level, women's flyweights, but you still have some young up-and-coming talent, like I mentioned. So the women's flyweight division isn't great. It isn't horrible. Valentina Shevchenko, if she were to leave, it would leave a massive hole within the division. But she's been around forever, and I think the women's flyweight division is still evolving, and I think it still has a lot of young up-and-coming talent. Now, when you get to the next division, which is women's bantamweight division, the champion's Amanda Nunes, this is when, everything kind of just falls off a cliff. Because bantamweight was the first division that came to the UFC with Ronda Rousey as the champion. And, it is looking like an absolute catastrophe right now. Number 1 is Juliana Pena. I know she's a former champion. That is not striking of an elite level fighter. Okay, then you get to number 2, Raquel Pennington. That fight against Ketlin Vieira was atrocious, and that was terrible. And the fact that Raquel Pennington is ranked number 2 is an embarrassment to women's MMA. Then you get down number 3, Holly Holm. At one point in time, Holly Holm, okay, she was a great fighter. She's getting up there in age. I think she's 41 years old at this point. She ain't got much more time in the sport, in my opinion. You get down to Ketlin Vieira. She looked awful against Raquel Pennington, and she's, her skill set is just lackluster to say the least. Leaves a lot to be desired. You get to number 5, Irene Aldana. She has some okay skills, But this division is just, I mean, after number 5, it's just it's just off a cliff. Yana Santos, Paney, I don't even remember how to pronounce her last name. Macy Chastone, she's okay, sitting at number 8. But then after that, I mean, you got Miesha Tate sitting at number 10. Miesha Tate's like 75 years old at this point. She has like 2 fights since 2016, 2 fights in 6 years, and she's ranked at number 10. So the bantamweight division, we're going to come back to the bantamweight division here in a second. I mean, absolute catastrophe. Then you have the women's featherweight division. Amanda Nunes as the champion. I don't know what to say about it. Go to the UFC's website. Look up the women's featherweight division rankings. That's all I got to say. The division does not exist. It's a fake division where Amanda Nunes is the champion, where the UFC pays bantamweight fighters to go up in weight class just so Nunes can beat them up and they can call her a double champion. The featherweight division needs to be closed down immediately. It does not exist. I repeat, the women's featherweight division does not exist, but it could. It could. And I'm going to talk about that here in a second. The UFC needs to close the women's featherweight division down if they're not willing to do anything. The fact that they don't even have, I don't even know, I can't even name another 145-pound fighter right now. I can't name one. Megan Anderson's gone. Chris Cyborg's been gone for years. I don't know. They're just paying fighters. I don't even remember. When's the last time the belt's been defended? I can't remember. Was that back in 2020? I mean, it's just crazy to me that this division still exists just solely based on the fact that Amanda Nunes double champ. That's it. That's the only reason it exists. And, I really think it's an embarrassment to women's MMA. I think it's an insult to the fans to have Amanda Nunes essentially not cut weight and beat a bum at 45 at this point. It made sense when you had Cyborg there. But at this point in time, it doesn't make sense. So I think they need to close down the women's featherweight division. Now, in terms of the massive catastrophe that I see coming, and it's almost definitely going to happen, when you go back to bantamweight, and even looking at featherweight, if it still continues to exist, even though it really doesn't, Amanda Nunes is probably going to retire sometime in the next 2 to 3 years, I would think. I don't see her sticking around for another 10 years. I think at some point in time, Amanda Nunes is going to decide to hang it up. There's been rumblings forever. She wasn't really motivated going into that Juliana Pena first fight. And that's kind of why she ended up losing, because she's just not motivated. She wants to spend time with her family. She's collected some decent checks from the UFC, beating up subpar competition. Up until the Juliana Pena loss, she hadn't lost since 2014. That just goes to show you, where women's MMA was in general. She hasn't fought terrible competition. By the way, the last women's featherweight fight was back at UFC 259 against Megan Anderson back in March of 2021. We're talking 2 years without a title defense because the division does not exist. But Amanda Nunes is probably heading towards retirement soon. Where does that leave the bantamweight division? If I have to watch a women's bantamweight division with the unskilled Juliana Pena as the bantamweight champion, I don't know if I can watch that. Put it on a separate card at that point. Put it on, I don't know what the UFC needs to do, but looking at that bantamweight division without Amanda Nunes, I hate to say it, it probably needs to be closed down as well. And I think this is partially the UFC's fault. You look at the featherweight division. Imagine, I'm not saying do it now because everyone's getting up in age. And on top of that, it's lost some of its luster. Why hasn't the UFC had Amanda Nunes, Chris Cyborg, and Kayla Harrison all in the UFC featherweight division? They should have shelled out the money, made it happen. At least for the last 3 years, we could have watched them all fight each other, and it would have been fun. And I think the problem isn't necessarily the talent in general. Obviously, that's part of the problem. But the UFC has made no effort to really attempt to acquire the talent that is out there and to expand the women's bantamweight division and the women's featherweight division. They're just, basically just filling slots on cards with some of these women's MMA fights, and they're just happy doing that. And then they're like, oh, we're throwing 2 title fights on the card. But the second title fight is a garbage fight, and it's just, without Amanda Nunes, which once she retires, depending on where the bantamweight division is, I think it needs to be abolished as well. So that's getting rid of half of the women's divisions within the UFC. And I feel bad saying this. I don't want anybody to lose their job. I don't want all these fighters to lose their job. But unless the UFC does something to acquire more talent, develop more talent within these weight classes. I don't know, what they need to do exactly. Maybe increase the pay a little bit. Try to attract some more of these women athletes to come to the UFC and be able to fight in the bantamweight weight class. But also go out there, and there's some of these up-and-coming fighters that are kind of scattered around to other organizations. Go out there and find a way to get deals done. Imagine how much better the women's divisions would have been with Chris Cyborg, with Amanda Nunes, and with Kayla Harrison, all at 145. It would have been much better. And I know we had the Cyborg-Nunes fight. That was one of the biggest women's MMA fights of the time. And we could have had that rematch. A lot of people wanted to see that rematch. I wanted to see that rematch. The UFC said, nah. And I know Dana had his problems with Chris Cyborg, but unfortunately it doesn't happen. So I really think you need to close down both those divisions if Amanda Nunes is gone, because that bantamweight division is horrific. I can't even look at it anymore. It's like Neil Magny's hairline. It's just terrible to look at. And then you add on the fact, what makes it worse. On its surface, it's bad, but it's like a problem you can kind of ignore. But what really makes it even worse is then they take some of these garbage women MMA fighters and they start headlining UFC Fight Night cards with. I mean, seriously. Yeah, I hate to even mention this. I can't even get the words out. It is supposedly happening in the main event of UFC San Antonio. Irene Aldana versus Raquel Pennington. The main event of UFC San Antonio. Shame on the UFC for that. I hope that arena is empty. That is the worst main event I've heard in a long while. And I thought, Mackenzie Dern, Yan Xiaonan was not a great main event. And that card was atrocious underneath of it. And that's the other problem. They put these women headliners, these terrible women headliners. And again, I'm a fan of some of these other divisions. I have no problem. Even Erin Blanchfield versus Talia Santos. I wouldn't have a problem with that being a headliner of a Fight Night card. Maybe at the Apex, a smaller card like that. But then on top of having these terrible headliners, they build the card in such a way where you don't even want to watch. It's like, because they get paid a flat rate by ESPN, it's like they don't care what type of cards they put on. I can't imagine. If you're thinking about going to that San Antonio card, please don't. Please don't. I mean, I can't even fathom what this card's going to look like. Irene Aldana, Raquel Pennington. And it was speculating, for those who wonder, it was being speculated that we were getting Nunes versus Irene Aldana on UFC 285. Well, apparently, Amanda Nunes didn't want to fight Irene Aldana for whatever reason. Said she needed to earn a title shot. And apparently the UFC wanted to do Juliana Pena versus Irene Aldana, which kind of makes sense, because Juliana Pena is number 1, Irene Aldana is number 5. They, Pena has the history with Nunes. I don't think Aldana has ever fought Nunes. Maybe it could be a number 1 contender fight. Pena said, I'm not fighting anyone unless it's the trilogy against Amanda Nunes, after she got like 50-43'd in the rematch at 277. So that card's atrocious. And it seems like they keep doing this just because they want to pump out as many cards as they possibly can. And, I think women's MMA is at a point where the UFC has to start filling out some of these weight classes. They have to start acquiring all the talent possible, because with some of these men's weight classes, whether it be bantamweight, whether it be lightweight, whether it be welterweight, they can afford to let Bellator get some of the talent. One championship can have some of the talent. Look at Bellator's bantamweight division. It's a solid bantamweight division. They have a decent lightweight division. They even have a decent light heavyweight division. The UFC can afford to do that because some of these divisions are so talent rich. Look at bantamweight. Even there's guys outside the top 15 I could see fight for a title tomorrow and potentially win a title. They cannot allow this to happen with women's MMA because, 2014, 2015, you could say, okay, it's still evolving. We're getting to the point where we're 9 years in, and I feel like it hasn't changed much over the last 3 to 4 years. I feel like it hasn't evolved much. And I'm worried for the future of it because I enjoy some of these fights. The Weili Zhang versus Rose Namajunas, both those fights were incredible. The Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk, both those fights were incredible. Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk, the first fight, maybe my favorite women's MMA fight of all time, and probably one of my top 10 list of favorite UFC fights of all time. That's how incredible that fight was. And if we can get some of these fighters from other, organizations, and we can start to fill out some of these weight classes, like women's strawweight, which isn't great. It isn't stacked, but it looks stacked in comparison to all three of the other weight classes. I think women's MMA can have a bright future. But if the UFC continues down the path they're currently down, I see a future where they could eventually get rid of it, or bare minimum, it's basically irrelevant and people are skipping those fights. Because we're at a point in time where there's a long running joke in the MMA community. Anytime there's a women's MMA fight, oh, bathroom break time. And I'm not to that point. Again, there is some of these fights that I'm looking forward to, like Talia Santos, Aaron Blanchfield. I'm looking forward to Weili Zhang's next fight, which is probably going to be against Amanda Nunes. I enjoyed watching Jessica Andrade beat up Lauren Murphy. But, some of these other fights, they're girls still ranked in the top 15. And there's not a high skill level. And you look at the pound for pound. I didn't even want to get into the pound for pound, but we might as well. We're already, going long into this video. I mean, the fact that Juliana Pena is ranked number 4 pound for pound makes me sick to my stomach. I don't know even how her trainer watches her hit pads and says, oh, this looks great. Can't wait to see you out there. Then you go down the list. I mean, you have Raquel Pennington at number 13 pound for pound. I mean, this is just terrible. But I'm not trying to sit here and bash women's MMA as a whole. I do enjoy it. But I enjoy it when we have elite level competitors. And at this point, once you get out of the top 5 of a lot of these divisions, we might as well be watching amateurs. It might as well not even call it pro MMA, because that's what it is. And of course, obviously the strawweight division is the strongest. The flyweight division is kind of making a come up. But these bantamweights and featherweights divisions, I don't even know how they can get any worse. And they seem like they have stagnated for the past few years. So let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Which divisions would you get rid of if it was up to you? Would you get rid of all 4 of them? I'm genuinely curious. Would you get rid of the 2 that I suggested they should get rid of? Especially if Amanda Nunes is gone. But they definitely should get rid of women's featherweight no matter what. The division already doesn't exist. So you're not really getting rid of it. You're just avoiding, eliminating a belt that Amanda Nunes gets to wrap around her waist. Let me know what you guys think. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.